Thank you very much. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, paramedics have been working without a contract now for 4 years. Paramedics want to hear that they'll finally be treated with respect and given the priority that they deserve. I'd like to ask the Premier, does the Premier think it's acceptable for paramedics to be asked to go to work every day under some of the most stressful conditions possible without a contract for 4 years?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, no, I do not believe it's acceptable that any of our contracts, Mr. Speaker, are lapsed by that length of time. One of the things that has become chronic here in Nova Scotia is contracts that are lapsed for a number of years before we actually get to a second contract. It would be my hope, Mr. Speaker, that we could come to an agreement with paramedics. I want to express my great appreciation for the work they do, and we want to express that in being able to negotiate a contract with them which reflects their desires and the province's ability to pay. At the same time, I also want to make sure that other contracts that are running out in this province need to get to the bargaining table so that we can find a resolution as quickly as possible.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
4 years, Mr. Speaker. 4 years. This government's been in place for 6 years. 4 years without a contract. And today, healthcare professionals of all varieties were gathered outside in the inclement weather we had today, Mr. Speaker. They were gathered outside this House to express their frustration with the state of healthcare in this province. And they shared their stories and experiences for situations that they encounter at work and how difficult it can be for them at work. When we've raised some of these issues, the minister yesterday said we focus too much on the problems. And we should focus on the good news stories. And Mr. Speaker, we'd love to do that. We would love to do that. But the issue is that the system is breaking down in so many levels. I'd like to ask the Premier, does the Premier think that it's just healthcare professionals and opposition members being too negative and that we all just need an attitude shift to improve healthcare in the province?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question, Mr. Speaker, and indeed thank all those healthcare providers across the province who day in and day out respond to the needs of our families to ensure that when people enter the healthcare system, Mr. Speaker, they talk about the great service they're receiving, the world-class service they're receiving from our healthcare providers. I understand the frustration that would be felt by paramedics around a contract that has been not solved for 4 years, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue to work to find a resolution to that. It in no way reflects our belief in what they are doing and the hard work they're doing. I believe if they look at this budget, there's a number of investments in it to continue to make sure we deal with some of the issues that they have talked about. They are part of the solution, as the honourable member would know. They're working in some of our CECs across the province today. We also believe it's with their insight and expertise that we'll be able to deal with the offload times inside of our community, and we look forward to solving those problems with them, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it's time for action on some of these issues, and healthcare professionals are worried, they're concerned. Nova Scotians are worried and concerned, and I heard from a family this week. A gentleman drove his mother from CBRM up to Halifax for an 11:30 a.m. appointment, was on the bridge at 10 a.m. and got a phone call that the appointment was cancelled because the machine was broken. Mr. Speaker, $11 billion budget before this House, and yet the healthcare system is literally breaking down in so many different areas. People need to understand that this government gets it, that this government understands the issues and understands the depths of the crisis we're facing now. I know this government has been very reluctant to acknowledge the state of healthcare in this province. I'd just like to ask the Premier, is the Premier willing to accept, does he have any more evidence, even based on the rally today, that the healthcare in this province is in a severe state of crisis?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable for the question. I want him to know, Mr. Speaker, we hear some of the challenges from our own constituents that are being faced in the healthcare system. We also hear from them many of the positive experiences they have. We know many of them are having challenges around primary care. As we solve that issue in one part of our province, it appears in another, Mr. Speaker. It's happening in my own constituencies it happens. But I think, Mr. Speaker, in order to have an informed debate, one that is respectful, Mr. Speaker, of all of the challenges associated, to somehow line that a machine broke at 10:30, Mr. Speaker, and that the Minister of Health or the government should understand and be able to anticipate the machine breaking, Mr. Speaker, that in actual fact we've continued to make investments. Mr. Speaker, I listened to the question, Mr. Speaker, and I think it's important that the people in our gallery get a chance to hear the Premier talk about health care. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, that is a very poor example. That is a very poor example. There are real challenges. The men and women who are in the gallery, Mr. Speaker, talk about the offload times. That's what we're trying to solve, Mr. Speaker. I think reasonable Nova Scotians would not blame the government for machine breaking down, Mr. Speaker, when it's repaired and up and running again. We've made investments, Mr. Speaker, in healthcare infrastructure, but there are challenges, and we want to work with those who have a constructive solution to those challenges.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Yesterday, we became aware of 2 allegations of aggressive and inappropriate conduct by the member for Yarmouth against former members of the House. And in the emails to you, Mr. Speaker, about these experiences, both complainants made reference to the Premier's having been made aware of what had taken place. Now, the Premier has spoken just now to media about how he does not feel that he had been, in fact, made aware of this. But the source of the statement that he had been made aware of these complaints at the time is Maureen MacDonald, the former leader of our party, the former Minister of Finance and former Minister of Health. Is the Premier, in fact, alleging that Maureen MacDonald and the 2 complainants in this situation are not providing accurate representations of the truth?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. Mr. Speaker, I in no way, Mr. Speaker, reflecting and making comment on what those members said. What I am very clearly telling the Honourable Member, at no time has anyone spoke to me about a physical contact between any of my members of my caucus or anyone else in this chamber, Mr. Speaker. I have, Mr. Speaker, been spoken to about the enthusiasm of some of our members, but at no time, Mr. Speaker, respectfully, no time, Mr. Speaker, let me be clear, at no time has anyone contacted me, Mr. Speaker, about a physical altercation with any of my members, Mr. Speaker, and I want to tell the Honourable Member, took this issue very seriously. Tuesday morning, I asked the person who my executive assistant has been with me since 2008 to ensure and look for any communications between the 2 former members and their 2 leaders, because it was also the former Premier as well as the current interim leader at that time when these allegations were being made, look for any information in my office and in my constituency office to my assistant. Same time, I went to the person who works in my office who's handled correspondence since 2012 to identify any issues associated with that, Mr. Speaker. There has been no communication issue around this particular issue, and at no time has anyone came to me around an issue of physical altercation with any of my members, Mr. Speaker, and if they had, let me be clear, that member would know, this caucus would know, and indeed Nova Scotians would know.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, last week when a motion was put to refer allegations of aggressive and inappropriate conduct against the member for Yarmouth, to put these allegations to the House Committee on Internal Affairs, the Liberals used their majority to vote that referral down. Now, that decision, in our view, lacked wisdom, and we opposed it. But the decision to block the reference to the House Committee seems even less prudent today in light of yesterday's allegations. Now, in light of new information brought forward yesterday by former members of the House, will the Premier now support a reference to the Internal Affairs Committee of these allegations of inappropriate conduct against the member for Yarmouth?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable for the question. The member from Yarmouth, the Minister of Education, continued to talk about his passion when it comes to defending his constituents and expressing himself, Mr. Speaker. I fully support the Minister. At no time has anyone brought to me any issue or allegation of physical contact with any members of our team, Mr. Speaker, and at no time would I stand for that, Mr. Speaker, so let me be clear about this. But at no time has anyone brought that to me. The issue was brought before the House last week, Mr. Speaker, was voted on, and we're looking forward to continuing to govern this province.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, I want to register my disappointment at reading reports of the statement issued by the Premier's office in response to yesterday's allegations. In that Premier's office statement, the member for Yarmouth states his view that, in contrast with his more elevated approach, quote, of late, some members of the opposition are more interested in coordinated personal attacks, unquote. I will table that. Mr. Speaker, this is a statement in which the Premier's office and the member for Yarmouth are diminishing the complainants in this case. Now, surely, if there's one thing that is known about responding in a responsible way to allegations of inappropriate or aggressive conduct, it is that diminishing complainants is never a path that anyone should follow. Will the Premier apologize for diminishing those who yesterday came forward with their experiences?
The Honourable Premier.
I want to thank the Honourable for raising the question. As I said, Mr. Speaker, to his second question, when this issue was brought to my attention on Monday night, Mr. Speaker, the emails that were forwarded not only to me, to him, to the leader of the official opposition, and Mr. Speaker, we were copied on an email that was sent to you. I took this issue very seriously, Mr. Speaker. At no time had anybody contacted me, Mr. Speaker, directly about a contact of any of my members when it comes to physical contact, Mr. Speaker, but I took it a step further, continued to make sure that I went through the entire record from those former two members as well as the two leaders that were currently leading the party at the time, to find out if there had been any information sent to me, Mr. Speaker. There was no information there, and I continued, Mr. Speaker, to go even further, to go into my own constituency office email to identify whether or not something had been brought to my attention. There was no information there, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to continue to make sure, Mr. Speaker, we listen, Mr. Speaker, to what the honourable member said. I'm not questioning, Mr. Speaker, whether they had an experience. What I'm telling you, Mr. Speaker, nobody brought a physical contact of any of my colleagues to my attention.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. In 2015, in-person prenatal classes were ended and replaced with an online course. That online course has since been cut, making Nova Scotia the only province in Atlantic Canada that doesn't offer some form of universal prenatal education, as explained in the CBC article that I will table. You know, Mr. Speaker, if you pair that with the ongoing issues regarding midwives in the province, lack of doctors, lack of nurses, it's making it quite difficult to have a baby in Nova Scotia. So my question for the Minister, what supports are being offered to pregnant women to help prepare for the birth of their children?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to be clear to the member that the work that the Nova Scotia Health Authority and the IWK do when evaluating programs and services that they offer, that they do that on an ongoing basis. As has already been publicly communicated by the health authorities, they've reviewed the programs that were in place previously. They felt that the resources and the investments to have the best health outcomes was to provide targeted supports, particularly enhancing those supports, Mr. Speaker, for those most vulnerable. But I want to also assure the member and all Nova Scotians that there are still opportunities if Nova Scotians have questions, need supports. Our public health professionals in our public health department can provide information, advice, and help navigate to resources to support those with prenatal needs.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
It makes it very challenging for those individuals that don't have any doctors. And if you do have a doctor, we're hearing from Doctors Nova Scotia that they're having to tell these individuals, go Google it. And yet how often do we all go into our doctor's offices and they say, don't Google that, that'll just get you paranoid and worked up. So, you know, the minister is quoted as saying that the decision to cut the online class wasn't based on cost, but it's hard to understand what else could it be based on. And again, Doctors Nova Scotia reaffirms that cutting the program was the wrong choice. When you are expecting a baby, your mind is going in 1,000 directions a mile a minute. trying to prepare, and this government has eliminated any resource that would have helped ease even a small amount of that stress. So my question is, will the minister tell this House where he expects pregnant women to turn for prenatal education?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. As the member noted, with respect to changes in the delivery of supports for prenatal information and support services, the Nova Scotia Health Authority made review. When I say that it wasn't about the money, Mr. Speaker, what I mean is that, or the cost of the program, what I mean, Mr. Speaker, is that they were reviewing and they were looking to ensure that the investments they make to support prenatal care were directed at programs and services that they've believed were going to provide the best outcomes for Nova Scotians. And Mr. Speaker, so they've made changes. They continue to invest. There's no change to the budget for providing support and services, but they have redirected the target of those supports and services to other areas to achieve better outcomes for Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Community Services. Nova Scotia is now the only province in Canada with closed adoption records. The Adoption Council of Canada believes that sealed adoption records perpetuate secrecy and shame within adoption. Mr. Speaker, for years, the minister has spoken firmly against calls from advocates to move toward a system of open adoption records in the province. However, a few weeks ago, the minister said in a radio interview that her department would begin consultations on this issue. Mr. Speaker, does the minister think it was appropriate to announce this policy change for the first time in a morning interview rather than speaking directly to stakeholders?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. In fact, the radio interview was prompted by a letter that I sent to a stakeholder on this particular issue. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
I'm glad to hear that answer. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, adopted individuals and birth parents should not have different rights based on the province in which they live. Our caucus supports open adoption records within a framework of safeguards developed in consultation with stakeholders and advocacy organizations like those implemented in other provinces. Mr. Speaker, will the minister tell us when meaningful consultation with stakeholders and advocacy organizations will take place and when legislation to open adoption records in Nova Scotia will be tabled?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. This process will be led by a subject matter expert. There will be a discussion paper released so that people who are contacting us, people that we are talking to, will be able to understand the difference between the various adoption systems. Mr. Speaker, I do want to correct one thing the honourable member has said. She has said that we have a closed adoption system. It is not entirely closed. Similarly, other adoption systems are not entirely open because in every case there is some form of a veto. So just so the honourable member understands that, number one. Number two, I would also note that we expect consultations to take place later this year with legislation to follow. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. Since 2017, the minister has taken heat for his government's explanations around a series of extra payments to universities. In 2017, the minister explained that additional funding to Acadia was issued because the school was negatively impacted by the 2008 funding formula, and I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. This week, we learned that that wasn't the only reason. According to a consultant's report, additional funding was required because of significant debt and a pension plan left underwater by the recession. So my question to the minister, when the extra funding came to light in 2017, why did he place most of the blame on a previous government's funding formula instead of explaining the actual factors?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Mr. Speaker, what I explained was the actual factor. The underlying reason Acadia took on debt was because they didn't have enough money because their funding was cut. If their funding wasn't cut, they wouldn't have taken on so much debt and then been drowned by interest payments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, in this article I just tabled, it says just the opposite. Every time these extra payments to universities come up, I feel like the story changes a little bit. If payments were made without full public disclosure, it's because the funding formula was bad. If the funding formula wasn't bad, it's because the institution worked really hard to turn things around and deserves a break. And if some universities received a break but others didn't, that's just because they all have different challenges. Forgive me, Mr. Speaker, if I struggle to believe the ministers this time. If any provincial universities were facing a fiscal position similar to that of Acadia 10 years ago, would we ever know?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Mr. Speaker, at no time did I lie, as the member is insinuating. What I did do, Mr. Speaker, is I said...
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Labour.
I'll carry on when the heckling stops, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I have said, our universities have faced challenges with funding. Goes back to the MOU, goes to the 10% cut the NDP imposed on him. Mr. Speaker, what we have done in the 4 universities that have received extra funding, we did go in, we had an audit done, a forensic audit done by a third party in every instance. We actually looked at ways the universities could save money. Many of the universities took very difficult steps. Many of them did not fill positions that had been vacant. Many of the universities sold assets. And Mr. Speaker, when we felt that everything had been exhausted by the universities, we topped them up, which I think is wonderful because it shows how much we value the universities, all 10 of our universities, as well as our colleges in the province, because they are an economic driver, they help employ our youth, and they educate our youth. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I must say, Mr. Speaker, I'm offended to believe that the minister has just called me something that I know in my heart of hearts I've never done in my life in this House. As the minister would be well aware, the current memorandum of understanding between the province and the universities is just about to expire. Over the last few years, I've met with plenty of students concerned about the affordability of universities in the province. Many are going to be paying for their degrees for years or even decades to come. And considering how much they're on the hook, for a lot of them, they feel they should have more say in how these MOUs are formed. So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister is, what specific consultation did this department conduct in preparation for the upcoming MOU with universities?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for the question. It highlights the say that students do have, which is quite significant in this province. Our department meets with student representatives from every university, as well as student groups 4 times a year as a department. I myself meet with them as well. Mr. Speaker, our students are actually represented on the Board of Governors of all the universities across the province, so they have a say right at the table. Mr. Speaker, we have an MOU that we are working on with universities, and to me it's also a concern about affordability for our students, and that's why in this budget I brought forward through the budget process and had full support of our government to actually make our Nova Scotia student loans fully forgivable upon graduation. And for low-income Nova Scotians, this here means that essentially they have not only free tuition, but even a little bit more money than free tuition. I think that's fantastic. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, the last MOU was intended to help maintain a quality, accessible and sustainable university sector. And Mr. Speaker, I can table that article. This has not been the experience of most universities over the life of this government. Nearly half of the province's degree-granting institutions have been in such dire shape they've needed emergency bailouts just to maintain services and avoid liquidating their reserves. And this is usually after they've increased the tuition as much as possible and cut anywhere they can. So my question to the minister is, as the financial picture for many of the province's universities has declined over the last MOU, how will the minister's approach to funding differ this time around?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So in an MOU, as we roll it out with our universities, it's even across all universities. What the member is pointing out is 4 universities received extra funding, and that's because those 4 universities were in a unique situation. What that reflects is our government's our support of our universities, our recognition of the important work they do. And Mr. Speaker, they do excellent work. Every one of them is important, and that's why we continue to support them, not only in funding outside the MOU, such as the instances the member brings up, but we have supported capital infrastructure, we've supported them with building new buildings. And Mr. Speaker, as we have capacity in this government, we'll continue to do so because the universities are a huge economic driver in the province. They are one of the primary reasons why our youth are remaining in Nova Scotia, whereas before they were leaving. And this government really, we truly value our universities, our relationships with them, as well as the students. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
If those universities are valuable as he says, as the minister says, they would all be treated equal. we'd be open and transparent about everything they got. And we'd know just what's going on with our universities, Mr. Speaker, and then the students would get the quality education they deserve. When I talk to post-secondary students, one of the complaints I hear over and over is that not enough is being done to help those in real need. This government has made some good faith steps, I have to admit, like forgiving the provincial student debt to address that disparity. But that's only a small fraction of the pressures on our students, Mr. Speaker. And it makes me wonder whether the minister is actually hearing students, or is he simply just listening to them? So my question to the minister, which groups or individuals were consulted in the course of lifting the eligibility threshold for the province's student debt forgiveness?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Mr. Speaker, in the fall I had meetings with both Students Nova Scotia as well as CFS. I've also, every time I visit a campus, I arrange to meet with the president of the student unions. And Mr. Speaker, the member brings up a very important point, which is affordability of our universities. That's why in the province of Nova Scotia, every Nova Scotian going to university receives a $1,283 bursary. That's why in the province of Nova Scotia, when you get a student loan, which is $6,800, 40% of it up front is a bursary. The rest is carried on a loan. And that's why in this budget, that a student in undergrad program will have up to 5 years forgiven of that Nova Scotia student loan upon graduation, because we do want our students to finish, get their degrees, and move on into the workforce and have a wonderful career. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, the big problem is students have to take on jobs in order to provide for themselves while they're in university. 5 years is a great idea. Mr. Speaker, not every student can complete that degree in 5 years because of the debt they're facing and the pressures on them to live in this city or other cities in this province. Low-income students can scrimp and save and hold multiple jobs, do as much as they can to make ends meet while they're in university. But often it's not enough, Mr. Speaker. Not having to pay for your student loan tomorrow doesn't put money in their pocket today when they need it. I'm sure the minister agrees that it serves no one if our graduates can't afford a foothold or if they've been forced to leave the province. So my question is, in this year's budget, did the minister consider introducing some upfront grants to significantly reduce the burden of low-income students attending our Nova Scotia universities?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We actually did that in last year's budget. We moved the weekly maximum amount of a student loan from $180 to $200, which moved it up to the $6,800. What we've done in this year's budget, which is the enhancement, is we made student loans forgivable. For clarity for anyone who has a student that comes into their office, the student, if they take longer than the 5 years to graduate, and they have loans for 6 years perhaps, what we will do is forgive their 5 largest loan years. So it's not that if the student doesn't graduate in 5 years, they are not eligible for loan forgiveness. They are in their 5 largest years will be forgiven. And Mr. Speaker, the program is designed to reward the student for graduating. And in the instances the students do not graduate, they still receive 40% of all the money up front as a bursary, which is non-repayable. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. We have asked both the Minister and the Premier about the cancellation of prenatal classes several times. The Premier himself said that he would look into why the in-person classes were cancelled. This morning, we learned that senior staff with the NSHA were instructing bureaucrats to be careful about how they communicated the final cancellation of online classes with the public, noting, and I quote, "There is high political attention and negative media attention to discontinuing universal prenatal classes," and I'll table that. Mr. Speaker, does the minister agree that his decision to cancel universal prenatal services in Nova Scotia has resulted in some loss of public health credibility?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The clarification of the member's statement there, this was not my decision. I believe the language used by the member in her question was something along the lines of explaining your decision to do this. Mr. Speaker, that wasn't my decision for this program change. As I've responded earlier today, the health authorities that are responsible for the operation and the delivery of healthcare programs and services on the front line, they review all programs throughout our healthcare system. This would be one of them, one that they've reviewed and determined that the resources and the investment and delivery will have better outcomes when they targeted people with higher needs based upon the utilization of the program that was previously in place.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, doctors in Nova Scotia are worried that new parents are getting less reliable information because we no longer offer that information publicly. We know that prenatal classes help new parents build confidence and connect with support networks that serve them long after their delivery. Without prenatal classes, Dr. Natasha Deshwal has nowhere to send her patients but Google. According to Dr. Deshwal, and I quote, "People are sometimes just not even bothering to get the information just because it's too much work. And if you're going to go online, you have to sift through to kind of figure out what's really valid and what's not valid." What a way to find out prenatal information. Mr. Speaker, the majority of other provinces offer prenatal education in person. Does the minister think this decision to cancel all public prenatal support will support maternal and infant health?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I want to make a factual clarification of the statement made by the member in her question. There is still prenatal supports and programs within the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. What they've done, as I've explained, is a particular program, the online course program offering. The Health Authority, as part of their overall review of prenatal programming supports that they offer, looked at the investment made in that program, the utilization, how many people were accessing and making use of that service to determine what kind of a positive impact it could be having, and they compared it to investing in other areas, particularly targeting more intense and available services for higher risk prenatal people with prenatal programs, Mr. Speaker. So they've rearranged the way that they deliver prenatal supports. That's what's happened. It's not been a cut of all programs and supports. It's been a realignment to have better outcomes.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. Universities in this province continue to struggle with sexual violence on campus. The Minister's department is continuing to work with the Provincial Sexual Violence Prevention Committee to implement recommendations from the Changing the Culture of Acceptance report, which is great. However, for the 2019-20 budget year, the Minister's department sought out $525,000 in funding to help advance its work on these recommendations, which is great too. But my question for the minister, can he actually confirm that these funds were secured? And if not, what impact will it have on the implementation process?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Mr. Speaker, thank the Honourable Member for the question. The funds are secured, and the funds will actually be put in the MOU, and they will be there annually for the universities. This is a very important subject matter. Even one sexual assault on campus is one too many, and that is why we have brought together this committee to actually look at what can be done to greatly reduce sexual violence on campuses. And our government is fully supportive of that objective. And Mr. Speaker, that's why we've given this we put a lot of emphasis on this, and that's why it's going to be in the MOU, and the funding will be there annually for the universities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the minister for confirming that. That's good news. Part of the challenge, however, around continued sexual violence on campuses is that there simply are not enough resources to go around. Students will tell you that it's not enough to try to react to instances of sexual violence, that it actually takes a cultural shift and a sustained proactive efforts from all of us. Prevention measures and measures to support survivors are equally important, and Students Nova Scotia has proposed a specialized sexual violence resource fund for universities that would go a long way to equipping institutions and students with the tools and strategies that they need. So keeping in mind that a culture of consent requires actions as well as words, has the minister considered implementing a sexual violence resource fund for all post-secondary institutions?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the member is correct that we do need a culture shift, and that's what the report that was actually put together directly spoke about, was changing the culture on our university campuses. And the culture goes beyond our university campuses. It goes to our education system, to our youth, talking to them, making sure they understand consent, both our sons and our daughters. Mr. Speaker, in terms of what we've done with the universities, we're all working collaboratively together. The funding is available for all of them. The universities with less resources are piggybacking off the universities with more resources. And as they work together, we are working towards improving the outcomes of having a reduction of sexual violence on campus. And whatever resources are there now, if we identify that more are needed, we're more than willing to talk to our universities and bring that forward as well, because this is something that has to change. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. So the government has decided, in my opinion, that it necessarily doesn't want to legislate on-campus sexual violence policies, and that's unfortunate. Instead, they believe an MOU with each university and college is sufficient to protect students, even if it becomes a patchwork solution. And I'll remind you, that's what it is right now. It's different at all these universities and colleges. There's no consistency, Mr. Speaker. After a few years of these MOUs having been in place, hopefully we are starting to see some real progress in the fight against on-campus sexual violence, but we do continue to read stories daily. So my question for the minister, can he speak to or table the latest stats his department has for on-campus sexual violence?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Mr. Speaker, one of the stats I can speak to, which was the most troubling, is 90% of victims do not come forward. They feel ashamed. They feel like they were not listened to. And Mr. Speaker, that's what we're trying to do with our culture shift. When we have victims, we do want them to come forward. Mr. Speaker, we are changing the culture on campuses, which means learning about consent. It means that when you are a victim, coming forward, because this behavior is unacceptable, and we need to support our victims. Mr. Speaker, I listen very politely to the members as they ask me questions. I wish they'd give me the same benefit as I'm trying to answer them. So, Mr. Speaker, this is a very serious issue, and it's one that our government takes seriously. The reason that this is all new is because we put it in the last MOU. It had never been there. And, Mr. Speaker, there is a framework, and the framework is about changing the culture on campuses. All the universities are following that framework. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Mr. Speaker, we're all concerned. That's why we're asking the questions here today. And again, you cannot improve what you do not measure. And there's no way to know if the action plan is working if you don't have statistics. The minister must know this. We all know this. And if he's serious about addressing the issue, he would be looking for regular updates on the progress of his plan. So my concern is that he doesn't have stats, he doesn't have a baseline, and he doesn't have any targets. Sexual violence, especially acquaintance sexual violence, is underreported. That means what statistical data we can get becomes even more important, or we just continue contributing to this stigma, which I want to stop. So can the minister please share if what his department's process is for collecting and analyzing on-campus sexual violence?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
So, Mr. Speaker, the framework does have measures in place. I do not want to misspeak to the measures, but what I am more than willing to do is have my department sit down with the MLA from Pictou West and actually go through every part of that framework, as well as what the measures are for the universities. Mr. Speaker, I've said this many times, our government takes this issue very seriously, and that is why we were the first government that brought in funding for this. That's why we put it in the MOU, and that's why the funding now in the upcoming MOU will be there for this matter, because the culture on our campuses have to change, society has to change, and Mr. Speaker, our government is fully supporting all the universities as well as the victims to come forward, because this is not acceptable on our campuses or in our society. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is also for the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. Mr. Speaker, the Graduate to Opportunity program was introduced by this government with a stated aim of employing post-secondary graduates. I believe we all agree with this goal. However, Mr. Speaker, all goals need measurements. So I'd like to ask the Minister if his department is collecting data on the number of GTO hires that are still in those jobs after 1 year.
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, we track our hires after 1 year, after 2 years. I'm more than happy to bring the updated list to the House. Mr. Speaker, as well as graduate to opportunities, we also launched Graduate to Innovation, which targets the master's and PhD level. Mr. Speaker, it's a great program which allows us to give an incentive to our business community to hire a new graduate, and I believe it's one of the key reasons why for the last 3 years more youth have stayed in the province than left, which is the first time that we've even had 1 year of positive net youth migration into the province since the late 1980s. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that answer. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure he'd agree that it's important to ensure these programs are also seeing plenty of uptake or availability outside HRM. It's particularly important to focus on GTO's impact in rural areas, smaller cities and towns, so that those graduates don't have to leave their communities to find work. My question to the Minister, with that in mind, can the Minister provide a regional breakdown of GTO hires across this province?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Mr. Speaker, we do have it broken down regionally, so I'll be more than happy to share that most up-to-date data and specific data with the member. And again, Mr. Speaker, for all the members in the House, with this program, we should be talking to all the businesses in our community. I tout this program from day one. Anyone I talk to, I tell them about it, because if you hire a youth, you're going to have the government subsidize a substantial portion of their salary over 2 years, and that is to help that organization to take a chance on a new hire, to also invest in that youth and give them the training. And what we also find, Mr. Speaker, is once that youth has 1 or 2 years experience, getting the next job is that much easier as well. It makes them employable, and it helps their career and shoots them on a great path. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Business. A new wave of cannabis legalization is coming this year in October when cannabis edibles become legal. The edibles market represents a new range of opportunities and risks which the government must plan for. However, the budget tabled in this House does not include any anticipated government revenue from edible cannabis. I'll remind the House it's in October. I'm concerned that the government is going to sit on their hands, as they did in the lead up to the initial round of legalization, allowing the black market to continue to flourish and leaving the public with more questions than answers about edibles. Mr. Speaker, will the minister table the government's business plan for edible cannabis products?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We continue with our discussions around edible cannabis. The points that my colleague brings out are valid points, valid questions. That is part of the work that we're doing now, and when we've made our final decisions and able to share that, we'll certainly communicate that publicly.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, with respect, this is a business question. There are justice implications, but this is about how the government runs its business. Since 2016, the government has known that cannabis legalization was going to be a reality, and the government decided that this was going to be their business. But as we have seen over the past year, they didn't do the work to prepare the province for the opportunities or the risks of legalization. Limited retail locations and limited supply have allowed the black market to flourish. CBD oil is well known to be one of the most popular cannabis products, in part because it's non-impairing. It's readily available through black market sources, and yet the NSLC has been out of stock more often than it's been in stock. Mona Stott of Truro reported in the media that because she could never find it, she said she went to her outlet 10 times asking. She now orders it online from the States. Mr. Speaker, what is the minister doing to ensure that Nova Scotians can start relying on the NSLC to stock the products they expect and are currently forced to buy illegally?
Just want to remind the Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party, it's the prerogative of the government to determine who answers the question. Thank you for pointing that out. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I don't dismiss the points and questions that my colleague is asking. This is a discussion that is holistic across government, Mr. Speaker, and takes in multiple departments. I am the lead, Mr. Speaker, and with respect, would respond to any of the questions that my colleague would present. Specific to supply, Mr. Speaker, supply is, as we know, a federal issue. Every province and territory is challenged by the producers to provide the level of product that they had committed to. We continue to work, Mr. Speaker, with all those stakeholders to ensure that as this market moves forward, there will be the appropriate supply available.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, a question for the Minister of Justice. We have raised questions in the legislature about the appointment of judges. Some of those questions have come into question. But I do want to ask the Minister, In March 14th in all Nova Scotia, the minister was quoted as saying, "We are in the process of doing a review, a jurisdictional scan of what happens across the country specific to this particular committee and its role." And I would table that, Mr. Speaker, but we cannot print from all Nova Scotia. But I will. My question for the minister, can the minister confirm he is reviewing the process, given the concerns raised by the judicial community?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are presently reviewing the process, and when that is finalized, we'll communicate it.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that is good to hear. I'm glad to hear that. Can the minister confirm that in the future, if he does convene a committee to provide him with a recommendation to make a judicial appointment, that he will accept that recommendation?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleague would know that the legislation clearly articulates that it is government's decision to make in those circumstances. We certainly value and appreciate the advice of the committee and the recommendations and advice that they advance.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Health and Wellness. Mr. Speaker, I was recently in touch with a constituent who relayed to me the situation with his 91-year-old mother. She had been living in Truro, but after a fall, some medical complications were detected and general confusion was evident, and the decision was made for her to enter long-term care. With no spots available in Truro, she agreed to move beyond the 100-kilometre radius around Truro. Fortunately, she was placed in a home in Amherst, but that presents some challenges for her only immediate family who live in Bedeck. So my question to the minister is, when a patient agrees to expand their preferred locations for long-term care, what factors go into determining the location of best fit?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's some variations in the circumstance. So, for example, in situations, Mr. Speaker, where the placement is of an urgent nature based upon the needs of the resident, that would be an influencing factor, wherein ensuring that the resident, the citizen, is placed to ensure that they're getting the care they need. That would be a driver, and then the location would be finding the first available location which meets the care needs of the Nova Scotian, because that is the driving factor first and foremost in those types of urgent situations.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there is more to the story, because on the morning of March 19th, while still at the hospital in Truro, the 90-year-old in question was informed she would be placed in Amherst. At around noon, she was told she'd be placed in Pictou, and that's where she was transported later that evening. 2 days later, on the morning of the 21st, she was then transferred to Amherst. As I mentioned earlier, the lady started in a confused state and now wakes up every day unsure of where she is. So my question to the minister, is the minister aware of other situations like this, and can he speak to anything within the placement system that might have caused this error?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not aware of this situation, nor an example as the member laid out to the floor, but as the member would know, Mr. Speaker, if he has more details, again, I think we all are hesitant, particularly when coming to healthcare related concerns of constituents, not to lay out too much personal information on the floor of the legislature. But as the member would know, if he has more details, he can pass it on either to me directly, and we can look into the circumstances, both to understand, obviously, so that we can bring improvements to the system if necessary.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my beautiful community advocate along the Fundy Shore has been with and without a nurse practitioner on several occasions in the recent history. Now, I do know that the Nova Scotia Health Authority does have advertisements out, and I'll post that for a nurse practitioner. But my question to the minister is, the travel distance from Advocate to the regional hospital is about an hour and 15 minutes to an hour and a half. My question is to the minister. Can he assist Nova Scotia Health Authority on making it a priority to fill this rather than just waiting for an applicant?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Certainly, recruitment of our healthcare professionals, particularly primary healthcare professionals, nurse practitioners and physicians, has been and continues to be a priority for the government and our partners, the Nova Scotia Health Authority. Again, I want to assure the member that the priority for the Health Authority is, in fact, recruiting health professionals to all of these communities. They do engage in recruitment initiatives and...
Order, please. Time allotted.